Greetings, lore seekers, and welcome back to the Lorelord, your guide through the most forbidden and controversial theories in Warhammer 40k. Today, we're tackling one of the oldest, most debated, and potentially most significant prophecies in the entire grimdark universe. What if the Emperor of mankind's death won't bring salvation or damnation, but both simultaneously? What if his tormented psyche is so fractured after 10,000 years of agony on the Golden Throne that when he finally dies, he'll split into two separate entities? One side, the Star Child, a being of pure compassion and hope. The other, the Dark King, a chaos god of tyranny and oppression that could make even Khorne look merciful. This isn't just fan speculation anymore. Recent lore from Games Workshop has breathed terrifying new life into this theory, suggesting that the Imperium's greatest hope and greatest threat might be the same being, waiting to be born from the Emperor's death. So buckle in, fellow heretics, because today we're diving deep into the Star Child prophecy and the nightmare scenario of the Dark King's ascension. To understand the Star Child theory, we need to go back to the very beginning of Warhammer 40k lore. This concept first appeared in the Realm of Chaos books from the late 1980s and early 1990s, the same era that gave us Malal and many other elements that have since been retconned or evolved. The original Star Child theory proposed that the Emperor's soul wasn't unified on the Golden Throne. Instead, his consciousness had fragmented under the immense psychic strain of maintaining the Astronomicon, holding back chaos and keeping his body from dying. The theory suggested that the good parts of the Emperor's soul, his compassion, his love for humanity, his original noble intentions, had separated and were gradually coalescing in the warp as a new entity called the Star Child. Meanwhile, the Emperor's physical form and the darker aspects of his personality, his ruthlessness, his willingness to sacrifice billions, his authoritarian control, remained bound to the Golden Throne, growing more tyrannical and monstrous with each passing century. The Illuminati, a secret organization of psychically awakened humans mentioned in early lore, were said to be working toward the Emperor's resurrection through the Star Child. They believed that if they could gather enough psychic energy and prepare the right circumstances, they could allow the Emperor to truly die, letting the Star Child be reborn while the corrupt remnants of his mortal form were destroyed. This theory was largely forgotten or dismissed as old lore for decades, but recent developments have brought it roaring back into relevance with a terrifying new twist. Everything changed with the Horus Heresy novel, The End and the Death, by Dan Abnett. In this climactic book, we're introduced to a concept that sent shockwaves through the 40k community, the Dark King. During the final confrontation between the Emperor and Horus, we learned that the Emperor had the potential to ascend to full godhood, to become a fifth chaos god of order, tyranny, and absolute dominion. This entity is referred to as the Dark King, and it represents everything the Emperor fought against, the ultimate manifestation of his authoritarian tendencies taken to their logical extreme. In the novel, the Emperor is faced with a terrible choice. He could embrace this power, become the Dark King, and defeat Horus easily. He would have the strength to crush chaos, to dominate the galaxy, to enforce his vision of human supremacy through absolute psychic tyranny. But in doing so, he would become exactly what he claimed to oppose, another god of chaos, perhaps the most terrible one yet. The Emperor, in a moment of profound sacrifice, chooses to reject this power. He accepts his mortality, accepts his defeat, and allows himself to be nearly killed by Horus rather than become the monster he could be. This act of selflessness is what makes his later imprisonment on the Golden Throne so tragic. He gave up godhood to preserve his humanity, only to be trapped in a living death for 10,000 years. But here's where the theory gets truly disturbing. What if that choice wasn't permanent? What if 10 millennia of worship, 10,000 years of being treated as a god by trillions of humans, 100 centuries of psychic agony and endless war have slowly transformed the Emperor into the very thing he rejected? The case for the Star Child theory. Let's examine the evidence that supports this theory, because it's more substantial than many fans realize. First, we have the established lore about the Emperor's creation. The Emperor himself was formed from the collective suicide of thousands of human shamans who merged their souls in the warp. This proves that human souls can combine to create a singular, powerful psychic entity. If it happened once, it can happen again. The worship of trillions of humans over 10,000 years could absolutely be creating something in the warp. Second, we know that the Emperor's consciousness is definitively not unified anymore. Multiple sources confirm this. In The Emperor's Legion by Chris Raitt, Gilliman's meeting with the Emperor is described in horrifying terms. The custodian Valerian observes that what sits on the Golden Throne is barely recognizable as the being they once served. When Gilliman finally speaks to his father, he comes away traumatized, suggesting that the Emperor's mind has fragmented into something almost incomprehensible. The book states, "He saw a living corpse, a desiccated skeletal thing of horror and pathos, surrounded by the debris of ancient machinery and half-understood technologies." More importantly, Gilliman reflects that the Emperor was a being of such immense power and ambition that he could never truly be understood. But now it seemed that even the Emperor himself had forgotten what he once was. Third, we have the Sensei, the Emperor's immortal children scattered throughout the galaxy. In older lore, these individuals were said to be immune to chaos corruption and possessed fragments of the Emperor's power. The Illuminati were supposedly gathering them for a ritual that would allow the Emperor to be reborn. While the Sensei have been largely written out of modern lore, their core concept, that parts of the Emperor's essence exist separately from his throne-bound form, remains compelling. Fourth, there's the undeniable evidence of warp entities being born from collective human emotion and belief. The Chaos Gods themselves prove this principle. Slaanesh was born from the Eldar's collective depravity. The Emperor is worshipped by more humans than any Chaos God has ever had followers. 10,000 years of prayer, devotion, and psychic energy flowing toward the Emperor would absolutely create something in the warp. In Dark Imperium by Guy Haley, we get this chilling description. The Emperor's light in the warp is described as a blazing sun of psychic might, but within it, shadows move. Not the shadows of demons seeking to corrupt, but shadows of something fragmenting, dividing, becoming multiple where once it was singular. Fifth, and perhaps most compellingly, we have the clear precedent that the Emperor can split his consciousness. He did exactly this when he created the Primarchs. Each Primarch was imbued with a specific aspect of the Emperor's psyche. Sanguinius got his nobility and sacrifice, Angron his capacity for empathy, ironically destroyed by the nails, Gilliman his administrative genius, Magnus his psychic ambition. If the Emperor could deliberately split off aspects of himself to create the Primarchs, what might be happening to his psyche after 10,000 years of unimaginable torture. The Legion of the Damned also provides intriguing evidence. These mysterious space marines appear when the Imperium is in greatest need, burning with holy fire and fighting with supernatural power. Some theories suggest they're guided by the good part of the Emperor's soul, the compassionate protector, trying to save humanity, even as his main consciousness grows darker and more tyrannical on the throne. The Dark King's Ascension. Now let's focus on the truly terrifying part of this theory, that the Emperor's corpse and darker aspects might be transforming into the Dark King after all, despite his rejection of that path during the heresy. The evidence for this is disturbingly strong. Consider what we know about how chaos gods are born. They're created from concentrated emotions and psychic energy in the warp. For 10,000 years, the Emperor has been worshipped not as a wise scientist king, but as a cruel, merciless god who demands absolute obedience and brutal punishment for the slightest transgression. The Imperium doesn't pray to the Emperor asking for compassion or wisdom. They pray for strength to destroy their enemies, for the power to purge the heretic, for divine wrath to smite the unclean. Every prayer, every human sacrifice, every moment of religious fanaticism feeds not the compassionate leader the Emperor once was, but a wrathful, authoritarian deity of mankind's worst impulses. In Godblight by Guy Haley, Gilliman has a revelation about his father. After fighting Mortarion and facing Nurgle directly, he realizes something horrifying. The Emperor was no longer merely a man perpetuating himself through will and ancient technology. He had become what he always denied: a god. But not a god of wisdom or benevolence. A god of mankind's desperate need for survival, their willingness to sacrifice anything and everything for one more day of existence. The book continues with Gilliman's internal monologue. This was not his father. This was not the Emperor who had walked among men with a vision of secular enlightenment. This was something new, something that wore his father's face, but thought with the collective desperation of a dying species. This was the God Emperor, and it terrified him more than any daemon. Consider also the nature of the Emperor's current existence. He's kept alive by the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers every single day. Their souls are literally fed into his consciousness to maintain his power. That's not the action of a benevolent protector. That's the feeding pattern of a chaos god, consuming souls to sustain itself. The Astronomicon itself might be evidence of the Emperor's transformation. It's described as a psychic scream of such intensity that it burns out psyker navigators who listen to it for too long. It's not a gentle beacon. It's a roar of psychic dominance that drowns out all other warp presence in its vicinity. That sounds far more like the manifestation of a chaos god of tyranny than a human soul trying to guide his people home. What's more, we know from The End and the Death exactly what the Dark King would represent. It wouldn't be random chaos, it would be order, taken to its ultimate extreme. Absolute control, perfect hierarchy, the total subjugation of every living thing to a singular will. Look at the Imperium in the 41st millennium, the ecclesiarchy, the Inquisition, the fanatical enforcement of rigid doctrine. Isn't this exactly what the Dark King would create? Here's the most chilling part. The Emperor rejected becoming the Dark King to preserve free will and human dignity. But the Imperium's response to his sacrifice was to build the most oppressive authoritarian regime in galactic history in his name. They're creating the Dark King themselves through their worship, transforming the Emperor into the very thing he refused to become through the sheer weight of their faith and fanaticism. The split destiny theory. This brings us to the complete star-child theory in its modern form. The Emperor's psyche is fragmenting under impossible strain. The compassionate, protective aspects of his soul, the parts that genuinely love humanity and want to see them thrive, are separating off, possibly forming the star-child in the warp. Meanwhile, the Emperor's physical form and darker aspects are being transformed by worship into the Dark King, a new chaos god of order and tyranny. When the Emperor finally dies, and he will die eventually, whether the Golden Throne fails or someone makes the decision to let him go, the result won't be simple. It won't be salvation or damnation. It will be both. The Star Child would be born as a new god of humanity, representing hope, sacrifice, genuine compassion, and the best of what humans can be. This entity would fight to protect humanity, not through domination, but through inspiration, empowering humans to reach their full potential rather than crushing them into obedience. Simultaneously, the Dark King would emerge from the Emperor's corpse, empowered by 10,000 years of authoritarian worship and blood sacrifice. This chaos god would wage eternal war to enforce absolute order across the galaxy, making even Khorne's bloodlust look chaotic by comparison. The Dark King wouldn't destroy the Imperium, it would perfect it, turning every human into a mindless extension of its will, creating the ultimate tyranny, dressed in the rhetoric of human supremacy. These two aspects of the Emperor would be locked in eternal opposition, fighting each other as much as they fight external threats. And humanity, caught in the middle, would have to choose which god to follow: the liberating but weaker Star Child, or the tyrannical but powerful Dark King. Some versions of this theory suggest that certain factions are already preparing for this split. The Illuminati, if they still exist, might be working to strengthen the Star Child. The Inquisition and Ecclesiarchy, perhaps unknowingly, are feeding the Dark King with their fanaticism. The conflict between these approaches has been playing out for 10,000 years, and it's about to reach its climax, evidence against the theory. Now, to be fair, we need to examine the arguments against this theory, because there are significant counterpoints that can't be ignored. First and foremost, there's no direct, canonical confirmation that the Star Child currently exists or is forming. While older lore discussed this concept, modern Games Workshop publications have been notably silent on explicitly confirming it. The Sensei have been largely retconned out of existence, and the Illuminati are barely mentioned anymore. If this was a major plot point GW intended to pursue, we'd expect more recent references. Second, the Emperor's fragmentation might not be creating separate entities at all. When Gilliman describes his father's changed nature, he might simply be witnessing the Emperor's consciousness expanded and transformed by godhood, not split apart. The Emperor could be becoming a singular new god, rather than fragmenting into multiple beings. Third, the entire premise assumes the Emperor will die, which isn't guaranteed. The Golden Throne has lasted 10,000 years. It could last 10,000 more. The Mechanicus might actually succeed in repairing it. Call has been working on understanding the throne's mechanisms, and if anyone could fix it, it would be him. The Emperor's death might never actually occur, making all speculation about what happens afterward moot. Fourth, there's the argument from narrative structure. Warhammer 40k's entire grimdark appeal comes from there being no hope, no salvation, only eternal war and suffering. Introducing a genuinely good god in the form of the Star Child would fundamentally alter this tone. Games Workshop has consistently moved away from giving the Imperium clear victories or hope. So why would they introduce a redemptive figure now? Fifth, the Dark King scenario has already been addressed in the lore. The Emperor explicitly rejected this transformation during the heresy. The entire point of The End and the Death was showing that the Emperor chose not to become a chaos god. Having him become one anyway would undermine that narrative sacrifice and make his choice meaningless. In Fury of Magnus, the Emperor tells his son, "I am not a god, Magnus. I never was. I am simply a man who saw what needed to be done and had the power to do it. If I become what they worship, then everything I fought for will be lost." This suggests the Emperor is actively resisting deification, not passively transforming into it. Additionally, some argue that what Guilliman witnessed wasn't fragmentation, but simply the Emperor's consciousness expanded to a scale beyond human comprehension. When you're maintaining a galaxy-wide beacon, holding back chaos, and processing the prayers of trillions, you might seem fragmented to a Primarch who can only perceive a tiny portion of that vast consciousness. The visions that tech priests and saints receive could be the Emperor deliberately presenting different aspects of himself to different people based on what they need, not evidence of actual psychic splitting. A soldier might receive visions of wrathful judgment, while a healer might experience compassionate guidance, all from the same unified consciousness choosing how to appear. Despite the counter-arguments, recent lore has been increasingly ambiguous about the Emperor's true state, which actually lends credence to the Star Child theory in an indirect way. In The Regent's Shadow by Chris Raitt, we see the perspective of a Shadowkeeper custodian who has spent time near the throne. The descriptions are intentionally vague, but deeply disturbing. To stand in his presence was to feel the pressure of something vast and terrible, something that remembered being human, but had transcended that state so completely that humanity was now just an echo, a fragment of memory rather than present reality. The book continues. The other custodians spoke of the Emperor as if he still existed, as he had during the Great Crusade. They were wrong. What sat upon the throne was simultaneously more and less than the Emperor had been. More in power, less in coherence. The light that blazed from his psychic presence was almost unbearable. But within it were shadows, not the shadows of demons, but shadows of absence, places where something that had once been part of him no longer existed. This description perfectly fits the Star Child theory. Parts of the Emperor's psyche have separated and exist elsewhere, leaving shadows in their absence. In Darkness in the Blood by Guy Haley, we get another intriguing hint during a vision experienced by Commander Dante of the Blood Angels. In his near-death experience, Dante perceives the Emperor not as a single entity, but as a multitude speaking with one voice, and yet within that chorus, distinct songs could be heard, some harmonious, some discordant, some singing of salvation, and others screaming of damnation. Even more recently, in Arcs of Omen the Lion, there are references to different factions experiencing radically different visions of the Emperor. The Sisters of Battle see a merciful savior. The Black Templars see a wrathful destroyer. The visions are so contradictory that they can't possibly be coming from the same unified consciousness, unless that consciousness has fragmented or is in the process of splitting. The introduction of the concept of God Emperor, specifically capitalized and treated as distinct from the Emperor in recent texts, is also telling. Characters are increasingly drawing a distinction between the historical figure who founded the Imperium and the deity that he's become. This linguistic shift might be preparing readers for a literal split between these two aspects. Let's consider what this theory means from a theological perspective within the 40,000 universe. If the Star Child and Dark King are both real and both developing in the warp, we're looking at a scenario unprecedented in 40k lore. We'd have two gods, both claiming to be the Emperor, both with legitimate claims to that title, both demanding worship and obedience from humanity. But they'd represent completely opposite interpretations of what the Emperor wanted and what humanity should become. The Star Child would represent the Emperor's original vision, a secular, enlightened humanity that transcends superstition and claims its birthright among the stars through reason and progress. But ironically, this would now come in the form of a god, the very thing the Emperor originally fought against. It's a tragic irony that the Emperor's good aspects could only survive by becoming the very thing he despised. The Dark King would represent what the Emperor became, a tyrannical god entity that demands absolute submission and crushes all dissent in the name of human survival. It would be the Imperium's worship made manifest, the logical endpoint of 10,000 years of fanaticism and authoritarianism. The question becomes, which one is the real Emperor? Is it the compassionate leader who wanted to uplift humanity? Or is it the ruthless tyrant willing to sacrifice anything for human dominance? The terrifying answer might be that they're both equally real, both equally the Emperor, because he always contained both aspects within himself. During the Great Crusade, the Emperor's compassion and ruthlessness were balanced within a single being. He could be kind, and he could be cruel, depending on what the situation demanded. But 10,000 years of torture and worship have torn these aspects apart, creating two separate entities from what was once one. If this theory is correct, what would actually happen when the Emperor dies and the split occurs? The immediate aftermath would be catastrophic. The Astronomicon would fail, at least temporarily. Warp travel would become impossible across most of the galaxy. The Imperium would fragment into isolated sectors, unable to coordinate or support each other. Terra itself might be destroyed in the psychic explosion of the Emperor's death and rebirth. But then, two new stars would ignite in the warp. The Star Child would manifest as a beacon of hope and inspiration, potentially creating a new, more compassionate Astronomicon that guides not through domination, but through willing cooperation. Followers of the Star Child might develop new, less oppressive ways of serving humanity. Simultaneously, the Dark King would emerge as a terrifying new chaos god, potentially more powerful than any of the existing four, because it would have the focused worship of trillions. The Dark King wouldn't scatter its attention across all emotions like the other chaos gods. It would focus entirely on order, control, and human supremacy. The Imperium would split, probably violently. Some factions would recognize the Star Child as the true Emperor and follow its more enlightened path. Others would see this as heresy and cling to the Dark King's familiar tyranny. Civil war would erupt on a scale that would make the Horus heresy look like a minor disagreement. Space Marine chapters would have to choose sides. The Blood Angels and Salamanders, with their more compassionate natures, might lean toward the Star Child. The Black Templars and Marines, malevolent, might embrace the Dark King's absolute authority. Many chapters would split internally, brother fighting brother over which god represents the true Emperor. The Mechanicus would face a similar crisis. Some tech priests might see the Star Child as the true Omnissiah, finally revealed. Others might argue that the Dark King's perfect order represents the ultimate expression of the machine, God's will. From a meta perspective, this theory represents a fascinating narrative opportunity for Games Workshop. It would allow them to have their cake and eat it too, providing hope through the Star Child while maintaining grimdark through the Dark King. The theory also allows for a fundamental shake-up of 40k's status quo without completely destroying what fans love about the setting. The Imperium wouldn't be saved or destroyed. It would be transformed, split into factions that represent different visions of humanity's future. This could open up new model lines, new armies, new factions. Imagine a redeemed Imperium faction following the Star Child, with new units and aesthetics representing a more hopeful vision of humanity. Simultaneously, a perfected Imperium under the Dark King could take the authoritarian aesthetics to their extreme. The timing might be right for such a development. With Guilliman returned, the Primaris Marines introduced, and the Cicatrix Maledictum tearing the galaxy in half, GW has already shown willingness to make major changes to the setting. The Emperor's death and split would be the logical next step in this narrative evolution. However, there's also the argument that GW might never pull this trigger. The Emperor's ambiguous state is useful for storytelling. He can be whatever the narrative needs him to be. Definitively resolving his status would close off narrative possibilities rather than opening them. So what's the verdict on the Star Child theory? After examining all the evidence, both supporting and contradicting, here's my take as the Lorelord. The theory is almost certainly true in some form, but probably not in the exact way we expect. The Emperor's psyche is fragmenting. The evidence for this is overwhelming. Whether this fragmentation will result in literal separate entities called the Star Child and Dark King, or whether it will manifest in some other way, remains to be seen. What I believe with near certainty is that the Emperor, as a unified being, no longer exists. What sits on the Golden Throne is something simultaneously more and less than human, something in the process of transformation. The compassionate leader who wanted to guide humanity to enlightenment still exists somewhere in that vast psychic presence, but so does the ruthless tyrant willing to sacrifice everything for victory. When the Emperor finally dies, and he will die eventually, something unprecedented will happen. It might be the literal birth of two separate gods. It might be a single god with two warring aspects. It might be something we can't even predict, but it will fundamentally change Warhammer 40k forever. The tragic irony is perfect for the grimdark setting. The Emperor fought against becoming a god and failed. He rejected the power of the Dark King and is becoming it anyway through worship. His greatest victory, choosing humanity over power, is being slowly undone by the very humans he saved. And if there is a Star Child forming in the warp, representing the Emperor's fading compassion and love for humanity, then it's a glimmer of hope in the darkness. But in Warhammer 40k, hope is often more dangerous than despair, because it gives you something to lose. The Star Child and the Dark King represent two possible futures for humanity, one of enlightenment and cooperation, the other of perfect tyranny and absolute control. The question is, which version of the Emperor will humanity choose to follow when they're finally forced to make that choice? What do you think, lore seekers? Is the Emperor fragmenting into separate entities? Will we see the Star Child and Dark King emerge when he finally dies? Or is this all just wishful thinking and pattern-seeking in ambiguous lore? Let me know your theories in the comments below. This has been the Lorelord, diving deep into the mysteries that shape the grimdark future. If you enjoyed this exploration of one of 40k's most significant theories, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Until then, remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, even gods can be broken. And when an emperor breaks, the whole galaxy trembles. Before we part ways, remember that here on the Lorelord, we don't just accept what the official lore tells us at face value. We question, we theorize, and we explore the implications of what these stories might really mean. The Star Child theory has persisted for over 30 years because it addresses something fundamental about the Emperor's nature, that he was never meant to be a god, and his transformation into one is the ultimate tragedy of Warhammer 40k, whether it manifests as literal separate entities or as a more symbolic split in how humanity perceives and worships him. The core truth remains. The Emperor of mankind is dying, and what will be born from his death might be humanity's greatest hope and greatest threat combined. Keep questioning the narrative, keep seeking the forbidden knowledge, and keep watching the Lorelord. Because the truth is out there. You just have to know where to look for it. Until next time, may the Emperor protect you, whichever Emperor that turns out to be. This has been the Lorelord. Stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop digging for the truth.